The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Nodulator Pro, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
Bern Tobin here on the Soybean School, joined today by Horst Bohner, Omafra Soybean Specialist. Sir, thanks for making the time.
Thank you. Yep.
Now, every year, you and I come visit you in your office, and we sort of like look back on the year that was soybeans. 2018 certainly was an interesting year. Let's start off with maybe the big number here, released last week, 54 bushels per acre.
Yeah.
You know, previous record, 48.3, and maybe that number, the final, the 54 number will move a little bit before we're done. First thing that comes when you start to assess this number is rain makes grain.
Absolutely. It really is amazing when you think about previous years and you know how we've struggled to get past 46. Because the last 5 years previous to this year, every year was 46 bushels, right? I mean, it was almost funny how every year the provincial average was 46 bushels. To jump to even, you know, the low 50s, absolutely amazing. And obviously
6 bushels, this is pretty
it's incredible. Number. It's incredible. And what makes it even more incredible, of course, is that when you have such a jump in the overall average, you've got some fields that had incredible numbers. Like personally in our trials and my trials, over 90 bushels, in some cases almost 95 bushels on pretty decent sized plot areas. I didn't even know that that was possible in some of those areas, because we're not talking really long season areas either, right?
Let's talk about the season. You know, let's deconstruct this a little bit. I mean, like, it was tough early, very dry, crusting, a lot of issues, some plant stand issues. But it actually, in hindsight, kind of worked to the advantage.
Isn't it amazing how it turns out? You know, if in the middle of July, you would have been here and we talked about the potential of the soybean crop, it would have been hard to be real positive, right? It was just so dry, thin stands, right? We were starting to get a few spider mites. They never really blew up in a big way. We had some aphids that needed to be sprayed, but you know, you're nervous about that when it gets dry. And then, you know, we were not really worried about white mold, which was a good thing, obviously. But if you think about making seed, making grain, you need water, and we just didn't have it. And so to go from such an extremely dry year to a record crop is amazing.
Now, we talked as well before we started about some of the things that may have been the result of this. You know, and that dry start drives those roots deeper. And you've always talked about, hey, how do we get more of the nutrients into those soybeans? Might that be part of the reason?
Oh, absolutely. You know, if we try in retrospect, look at it and explain what happened, I think those lower plant populations were actually positive, because later on, if you get a lot of moisture, a little less disease, right? Early dry also helps us with respect to soil health and root health is really what I meant there. Root health, right? Because we don't get all those root rots on there. Then it drives them deeper, as you already mentioned. And of course, if you have deep roots and then it rains in August, you have much more capacity to pull up the nutrients, and of course you need the moisture too. Because what happens often in the spring in Ontario is we get too much moisture, and those roots, they don't really go anywhere, and you start to get some root rot set in, and you get this little ball, right, of roots. And then of course it dries out in August. When you really need the roots to be able to take in the water, if you get it, you don't have them. And this year was the opposite. So certainly I think that was a big one, the lack of white mold, because it was dry early on. And then I personally have this theory, and I'm not sure we have a full understanding yet as an industry on this one, but early season stress seems to stimulate more flowering, right? And how to mimic that, you know, we've tried with various experiments. It's very difficult to achieve, but when it happens in nature, it's incredible. So we have, you know, a setup that's really stressful for the plant. And you almost come to the conclusion, that if you look at your beans in June, you should be worried. That's a good thing. Isn't that funny, Like, I mean, you think that's impossible, but they really should be stressed early on, and then as long as you get the rain after, you can have quite an incredible crop. The problem with that story is, if they're really stressed early on, and it continues to be really stressed, obviously the yield isn't there.
Right. So I think, and also an interesting part of this is 2012, the last number, 48.3, which is the last record, a very similar year. Dry early, timely rains, or good moisture at the end.
Yeah,
so is it really telling us that it really is a case of soybeans are tinge of dryness early and moisture late?
Yeah, or the other way to put it is, I guess, if you have early season moisture, excess early season moisture, it can cause you a lot of problems, right? I mean, that's the other way to look at it. And there is something about this early season stress that in the long run can help soybeans. But the other side of it is, all these factors have to work together, of course, right? And we don't always have that. But the fascinating point from an agronomic standpoint is, what does this mean for the future? How do we set ourselves up to try and maximize the growing season if it turns out this way, or it turns out completely dry, or it turns out completely wet through the whole season, right? You got to try and think through different scenarios in terms of what does it actually mean. Because it's fine to try and explain it, but what does it mean for the future?
How do we manage it? How do we react?
That's right. What do we do? Yeah.
Well, keep working.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very encouraged, to be honest with you. We've had some really good luck with our fertility work. If you have the nutrients there and you get the moisture, you've got an opportunity to get some of these high yields. And if you don't have that, the potential isn't there, right?